Iran, getting a lot of the things that they should have given us a long time ago. We'll see how it works out, but they're very good, moving along very nicely. They've destroyed a lot of additional targets today, and we will probably, I think we'll make a deal with them, pretty sure, but it's possible we won't. But we've had regime change, if you look already, because the one regime was decimated, destroyed, they're all dead. The next regime is mostly dead. And the third regime, we're dealing with different people than anybody's dealt with before. It's a whole different group of people. So I would consider that regime change. And frankly, they've been very reasonable. So I think we've had regime change. But you can't do much better than that. The regime that was really bad, really evil was the first one. That was done. The second was appointed, and they're gone. They're all dead, other than one who may have a little life, you know. And then they're really in the third group, and the third group of people that seem to be much more reasonable. It truly is regime change.
What you're hearing in that CNN clip is not casual rhetoric. When Donald Trump talks about the United States potentially taking the oil in Iran, he is stepping outside traditional diplomatic language and into a much more direct form of strategic signaling. This isn't about negotiation tone anymore. It's about leverage, specifically, leverage over the most critical part of Iran's economic structure. To understand why this matters, you have to look at timing first. Iran has already dismissed the U.S. proposal as unrealistic. In diplomatic terms, that usually means the offer is seen as one-sided or structured in a way that leaves little room for compromise. When that happens, the next move is often pressure. And that's exactly what this statement represents, an escalation designed to shift the balance. The focus on oil is not accidental. Iran's economy is heavily dependent on energy exports. Oil is not just a sector, it is the foundation of government revenue, foreign currency inflow, and overall economic stability. Most of that export capacity is concentrated in a few critical locations, particularly Kharg Island, which handles the majority of Iran's crude shipments. When Trump references taking the oil, he is effectively pointing at that system. Now, it's important to be precise about what that actually means. This is not about physically occupying oil fields in the traditional sense. In today's context, taking the oil is more about control and disruption. It could mean targeting export infrastructure, restricting shipping routes, or applying military pressure around key maritime choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. The objective is not ownership, it's denial. Denying Iran the ability to generate revenue. That distinction matters because it explains why this kind of language is used. It is meant to introduce a clear consequence. If negotiations fail, the cost will not be immediate. At the same time, this statement is not only directed at Iran, it is also a message to multiple audiences. For U.S. allies in the region, it signals a willingness to escalate. For global markets, it introduces uncertainty, and domestically, it frames the situation as a firm response rather than a stalled negotiation. But there is a structural challenge here. Iran is not a passive actor, and its geography complicates any attempt to control or disrupt its oil flow. The Strait of Hormuz, for example, is one of the most strategically sensitive waterways in the world. A significant portion of global oil passes through it. Any attempt to interfere with that route carries immediate international consequences. This is why statements like this are rarely about execution in a literal sense. They are about positioning. The goal is to increase perceived risk for the other side. If Iran believes that its export infrastructure could become a target, it has to factor that into its decision-making process. That's where the pressure comes from. Iran's response gives you insight into how this is being interpreted. By rejecting the terms outright, they are signaling that they are not willing to negotiate under coercive conditions. This sets up a familiar pattern. One side increases pressure, the other resists. What typically follows is not immediate large-scale conflict, but a period of controlled escalation. You see smaller actions, indirect responses, and strategic signaling from both sides. In this context, that could include increased activity around shipping routes, regional proxy movements, or limited strikes designed to test boundaries without triggering a full confrontation. The reason oil becomes central in this phase is because it amplifies impact. Unlike other targets, energy infrastructure has immediate global relevance. Even a minor disruption can affect pricing, supply chains, and market stability. That creates a multiplier effect. A regional action produces global consequences. This is where the situation becomes more complex. Once oil is part of the equation, other countries become indirectly involved, not militarily, but economically. Any threat to supply flows affects importers, insurers, and shipping companies. That adds another layer of pressure, because instability in energy markets rarely stays contained. There is also a psychological dimension to this. Publicly stating a willingness to target oil infrastructure introduces uncertainty inside Iran's leadership. It forces a reassessment of risk. The question is no longer just whether to accept or reject a proposal, but what the cost of rejection might be in concrete terms. At the same time, this kind of rhetoric carries its own risks. If the threat is perceived as credible, it can trigger preemptive responses. Iran has historically relied on asymmetric strategies, targeting shipping, using proxy forces, or applying pressure where it can avoid direct confrontation. When oil becomes the focal point, those responses often align with that domain. That's why this moment is more than just a headline. It reflects a shift in how pressure is being applied. The focus is moving away from long-term economic measures like sanctions and toward immediate, high-impact leverage points. In practical terms, what you're seeing is the transition from negotiation to strategic positioning. Both sides are defining their limits, signaling their capabilities, and testing how far the other is willing to go. The language becomes sharper because the stakes are higher. Once Iran rejects a proposal and the response shifts into this kind of language, the situation moves into a different phase. It's no longer about negotiating terms. It becomes about applying pressure. Both sides are trying to improve their position before any future agreement. Once both sides are operating around energy infrastructure, even small actions can have wider consequences. A single incident involving a tanker or a port can quickly affect supply chains and insurance costs. The impact spreads beyond the immediate area. This is why escalation in this context is harder to control. It doesn't stay contained between two actors. It starts affecting other countries, not because they are directly involved, but because they depend on stable energy flow. Another factor is perception. A move intended as a warning can be seen as a threat. That's where miscalculation becomes a real risk. At the same time, neither side is likely aiming for full-scale conflict. The costs are too high. What both sides are trying to do is apply enough pressure to shift the situation in their favor without crossing a line. That creates a narrow operating space. There is also internal pressure. Leadership decisions are not made in isolation. Domestic audiences expect strength, especially after public rejection. That makes it harder to step back once strong language has been used. From here, there are a few realistic directions this can take: controlled de-escalation, sustained pressure, or a move into direct action. What determines the path is not just capability, but perception. If both sides recognize the risk of escalation, there is more incentive to stabilize. Right now, the situation is balanced between pressure and restraint. The language has intensified, but actions have not yet crossed into open confrontation. Once oil becomes the center of a geopolitical standoff, the stakes expand immediately. What you're seeing is not a final stage, but a transition. And transitions like this are where the direction of the situation is ultimately decided.